and welcome to the Deerfield Public Library Twitch channel. I'm Anne.
I'm Christina.
And this is Lunchtime Listens, where members of staff read spooky books this time, but not always.
Always spooky.
We read books to you. We have been making our way through The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson in honor of spooky season. And Christina wore the appropriate earrings for today, and a dress, and a bag. Oh, everything. I just wore black.
Halloween's my favorite. This is like my week.
This is your week.
To show off every outfit.
And I was going to ask you before we got started, we had decided last week or the week before that we were going to dress up as Theodora and Eleanor for Halloween for next week, the conclusion of The Haunting of Hill House. So very important question, Christina. Do you want to be Eleanor or Theodora?
I don't know.
I did order a red sweater and a mustard yellow sweater.
Okay, cool. So it does not matter.
I am ready for either. And I think we probably wear about the same size of sweater, so we can literally just switch.
Perfect.
They will be the same sweater. So you can think about this.
Okay, I'll have to think about it. Maybe I'll let you know at the end of this episode.
Perfect. There we go. Stick around. For those of you who are new to Lunchtime Listens and want to catch up, all of our episodes are available the Thursday following our live session. So this will be up on YouTube this Thursday. And tune in next Monday, Halloween, for the conclusion of The Haunting of Hill House and to see what we're doing next. Woo! So last time we got some more stuff about the house being creepy and being built incorrectly, and they all were very, very calm about it during the day and then not calm at night. And the house is focusing in on Eleanor.
Yes.
And we learned that Dr. Montague's wife would be arriving on Saturday.
But does she really exist?
Do any of them really exist?
I don't know. That's what I said last time. I'm like, are we gonna get to the end and it's just maybe Eleanor's the only real one and she's just sitting in like rubble, like the foundation of a house that no longer exists?
Yeah, we're gonna find out. All right, you ready?
Yes.
Chapter 7. On the afternoon of the day that Mrs. Montague was expected, Eleanor went alone into the hills above Hill House, not really intending to arrive at any place in particular, not even caring where or how she went, wanting only to be secret and out from under the heavy, dark wood of the house. She found a small spot where the grass was soft and dry and lay down, wondering how many years it had been since she had lain on soft grass to be alone to think. Around her, the trees and wildflowers, with that oddly courteous air of natural things suddenly interrupted in their pressing occupations of growing and dying, turned toward her with attention, as though dull and imperceptive as she was, it was still necessary for them to be gentle to a creation so unfortunate as to not be rooted in the ground, forced to go from one place to another, heartbreakingly mobile. Ideally, Eleanor would not be in this situation. Idly, Eleanor picked a wild daisy, which died in her fingers, and, lying on the grass, looked up into its dead face. There was nothing in her mind beyond an overwhelming, wild happiness. She pulled at the daisy and wondered, smiling at herself, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? The house is getting to her. The house is getting to her. Put the bags down in the hall, Arthur, Mrs. Montague said. She has arrived. Which means it's Saturday. Which means it's been almost a week they've been in Hill House. Wouldn't you think there'd be someone here to help us with this door? They'll have to get someone to take the bags upstairs. John! My dear. Dr. Montague hurried into the hallway, carrying his napkin, and kissed his wife obediently on the cheek she held out for him. How nice that you got here. We'd given you up. I said I'd be here today, didn't I? Did you ever know me not to come when I said I would? I brought Arthur. Arthur, the doctor said without enthusiasm. Well, somebody had to drive, Mrs. Montague said. I imagine you expected I would drive myself all the way out here? Because you know perfectly well that I get tired. How do you do?
I get tired.
It's a long drive. How do you do? The doctor turned, smiling on Eleanor and Theodora with Luke behind them, clustered uncertainly in the doorway. My dear, he said, these are my friends who have been staying in Hill House with me these past few days. Theodora, Eleanor Vance, Luke Sanderson. Theodora, just Theodora. Theodora and Eleanor and Luke murmured civilly, and Mrs. Montague nodded and said, I see you didn't bother to wait dinner for us. We'd given you up, the doctor said. I believe that I told you I would be here today. Of course, it is perfectly possible that I am mistaken, but it is my recollection that I said I would be here today. I'm sure we'll get to know all your names very soon. This gentleman is Arthur Parker. He drove me here because I dislike driving myself. Arthur, these are John's friends. Can anybody do something about our suitcases? Mrs. Montague's a lot. The doctor and Luke approached, murmuring, and Mrs. Montague went on. I am to be in your most haunted room, of course. Arthur can go anywhere. That blue suitcase is mine, young man, and the small attaché case. They will go in your most haunted room. The nursery, I think, Dr. Montague said when Luke looked at him inquiringly. I believe the nursery is one source of disturbance, he told his wife, and she sighed irritably. It does seem to me that you could be more methodical, she said. You've been here nearly a week, and I suppose you've done nothing with the planchette? Automatic writing? I don't imagine either of these young women has mediumistic gifts. Those are Arthur's bags right there. He brought his golf clubs just in case. Just in case of what? Theodora asked blankly, and Mrs. Montague turned to regard her coldly. Please don't let me interrupt your dinner, she said finally. There's a definite cold spot just outside the nursery door, the doctor told his wife hopefully. Yes, dear, very nice. Isn't that young man going to take Arthur's bags upstairs? You do seem to be in a good deal of confusion here, don't you? After nearly a week, I certainly thought you'd have things in some kind of order. Any figures materialize? There's been decided manifestations. Well, I'm here now, and we'll get things going right. Where is Arthur to put the car? There's an empty stable in back of the house where we have put our other cars. He can take it around in the morning. Nonsense. I do not believe in putting things off, John, as you know perfectly well. Arthur will have plenty to do in the morning without adding to night's work. He must move the car at once. It's dark outside, the doctor said hesitantly. John, you astound me. Is it your belief that I do not know whether it is dark outside at night? The car has lights, John, and that young man can go with Arthur to show him the way. Thank you, said Luke grimly, but we have a positive policy against going outside after dark. Arthur may, of course, if he cares to, but I will not. The young ladies, the doctor said, had a shocking young man's a coward, Arthur said. He had concluded his fetching of suitcases and golf bags and hampers from the car, and now stood beside Mrs. Montague, looking down on Luke. Arthur's face was red and his hair was white, and now scorning Luke, he bristled. Ought to be ashamed of yourself, fellow, in front of the women. The women are just as much afraid as I am, Luke said primly. Indeed, indeed. Dr. Montague put his hand on Arthur's arm soothingly. After you've been here for a while, Arthur, you'll understand that Luke's attitude is sensible, not cowardly. We make a point of staying together after dark. I must say, John, I never expected to find you all so nervous, Mrs. Montague said. I deplore fear in these matters. She tapped her foot irritably. You know perfectly well, John, that those who have passed beyond expect to see us happy and smiling. They want to know that we are thinking of them lovingly. The spirits dwelling in this house may actually be suffering because they are aware that you are afraid of them. Mrs. Montague has not experienced, alas. We can talk about it later, the doctor said wearily. Now how about dinner? Of course. Mrs. Montague glanced at Theodora and Eleanor. What a pity that we had to interrupt you, she said. Have you had dinner? Naturally, we have not had dinner, John. I said we would be here for dinner, didn't I? Or am I mistaken again? At any rate, I told Mrs. Dudley that you would be here, the doctor said, opening the door which led to the game room and on into the dining room. She left us a splendid feast. Poor Dr. Montague, Eleanor thought, standing aside to let the doctor take his wife into the dining room. He is so uncomfortable. I wonder how long she is going to stay. She really is like Whirlwind. I forgot how she just comes in and like basically upends everything.
I'm like, whoa.
Woo! I wonder how long she's going to stay, Theodora whispered in her ear. Maybe her suitcase is filled with ectoplasm, Eleanor said hopefully. And how long will you be able to stay? Dr. Montague asked, sitting at the head of the dinner table with his wife cozily beside him. Well, dear, Mrs. Montague said, tasting daintily of Mrs. Dudley's caper sauce. You have found a fair cook, have you not? You know that Arthur has to get back to his school. Arthur is a headmaster, she explained down the table, and he has generously canceled his appointments for Monday. So we'd better leave Monday afternoon, and then Arthur can be there for classes on Tuesday. A lot of happy schoolboys Arthur no doubt left behind, Luke said softly to Theodora, and Theodora said, but today is only Saturday.
Dang, thank goodness it's Saturday evening.
Dang. I do not mind this cooking at all, Mrs. Montague said. John, I will speak to your cook in the morning. Mrs. Dudley is an admirable woman, the doctor said carefully. Bit fancy for my taste, Arthur said. I'm a meat and potatoes man myself, he explained to Theodora. Don't drink, don't smoke, don't read trash. That sounds boring. Bad example for the fellows at school. They look up to one a bit, you know. I'm sure they must all model themselves on you, Theodora said soberly. Get a bad hat now and then, Arthur said, shaking his head. No taste for sports, you know. Moping in corners, crybabies. Knock that out of them fast enough. He reached for the butter. Arthur is a trick. Mrs. Montague leaned forward to look down the table at Arthur. Eat lightly, Arthur, she advised. We have a busy night ahead of us.
I'm like, how do they know each other? Like, I was like trying to figure out who Arthur was. And I was like, is he their driver? No, he's got a whole job already. Like, what?
Well, you know. Is Mrs. Montague having an affair with Arthur? You decide. Anyways. What on earth do you plan to do? The doctor asked. I'm sure that you would never dream of going about these things with any system. He's like a scientist.
I know. I'm like, what's her job? Is she a scientist?
Yes. Oh, thank you. 11 Strike says, is Hill House prepared for trouble? Make it double. Yes. Hill House is definitely prepared for that. Anyways, I'm sure you would never dream of going about these with any systems, but you will have to admit, John, that in this area I have simply more of an instinctive understanding. Women do, you know, John. At least some women. She paused and regarded Eleanor and Theodora speculatively. We hate women who don't support other women.
She doesn't even know them.
Yeah, she doesn't even know them. Neither of them, I dare say. Unless, of course, I am mistaken again. You are very fond of pointing out my errors, John. My dear, I cannot abide a slipshod job in anything. Arthur will patrol, of course. I brought Arthur for that purpose. It is so rare, she explained to Luke, who sat on her other side, to find persons in the educational field who are interested in the other world. I wonder why. It's because most people who have an education think ghosts don't exist. I know Hill House is evil, but you know. Anyways, you will find Arthur surprisingly well informed. I will recline in your haunted room with only a nightlight burning, and will endeavor to get in touch with the elements disturbing this house. I never sleep when there are troubled spirits about, she told Luke, who nodded, speechless. Little sound common sense, Arthur said. Got to go about these things in the right way. Never pays to aim too low. Tell my fellows that. I think perhaps after dinner we will have a little session with planchette, Mrs. Montague said. Just Arthur and I, of course. The rest of you, I can see, are not ready yet. You would only drive away the spirits. We will need a quiet room. The library, Luke suggested politely. The library? I think it might do. Books are frequently very good carriers, you know. Materializations are often best produced in rooms where there are books. I cannot think of any time when materialization was in any way hampered by the presence of books. I suppose the library has been dusted. Arthur sometimes sneezes. I just like to say that our library is not haunted.
That we know of.
Well, to be actually, according to Pam, who is the head of support services, this is the least haunted library she's ever worked in.
Oh.
And so, you know.
And she is in, like, probably the spookiest office.
Yes, in the basement.
So. Good authority, good
our
authority.
library is not haunted, as much as sometimes we would wish it to be haunted. Plus, apparently, I'm like a ghost negator. So every time I go places that are supposedly haunted, except for my apartment where we had unexplained walking, which was probably just pipes, but it really did sound like someone stomping back and forth.
Oh my gosh.
But like I'm apparently a ghost negator. Like every time I go places that are haunted,
Nothing
nothing ever happens. Anyways, sorry to disappoint you that the library is not haunted. Mrs. Dudley keeps the entire house in perfect order, the doctor said about the library being dusted. I really will speak to Mrs. Dudley in the morning. You will show us the library then, John, and that young man will bring down my case. Not the large suitcase, mind, but the small attaché case. Bring it to me in the library. We will join you later. After a session with planchette, I require a glass of milk and perhaps a small cake. Crackers will do if they are not too heavily salted. A few minutes of quiet conversation with congenial people is also very helpful, particularly if I am to be receptive during the night. The mind is a precise instrument and cannot be tended too carefully. Arthur? She bowed distantly to Eleanor and Theodora and went out, escorted by Arthur, Luke, and her husband. After a minute, Theodora said, I think I'm going to be simply crazy about Mrs. Montague. I don't know, Eleanor said. Arthur is rather more to my taste, and Luke is a coward, I think. Poor Luke, Theodora said. He never had a mother. Looking up, Eleanor found that Theodore was regarding her with a curious smile, and she moved away from the table so quickly that a glass spilled. "We shouldn't be alone," she said, oddly breathless. We've got to find the others. Is she oddly breathless because she's alone with Theodora? Is she oddly breathless because the house is extremely haunted? You know. We shouldn't be alone, she said, oddly breathless. We've got to find the others. She left the table and almost ran from the room, and Theodora ran after her, laughing, down the corridor and into the little parlor where Luke and the doctor stood before the fire. "Please, sir," Luke was saying meekly, "who is Planchette?"
Aw, poor Luke.
The doctor sighed irritably. "Imbeciles," he said. "And sorry, the whole idea annoys me, but if she likes it..." He turned and poked the fire furiously. "Planchette," he said, he went on after a moment, "is a device similar to the Ouija board. Or perhaps I might explain it better by saying that it is a form of automatic writing, a method of communicating with, intangible beings. Although, to my way of thinking, the only intangible beings who ever got in touch through one of those things are the imaginations of the people running it. Yes, well, planchette is a little piece of light wood, usually heart-shaped or triangular. A pencil is set into the narrow end, and at the other end is a pair of wheels, or feet, which will slip easily over paper. Two people place fingers on it, ask it questions, and the object moves, pushed by what force we will not here discuss, and writes answers. The Ouija board, as I said, is very similar, except that the object moves on a board pointing to separate letters. An ordinary wine glass will do the same thing. I've seen it tried with a child's wheeled toy, although I will admit that it looks silly. Each person who uses the tips of the fingers of one hand, keeping the other hand free to note down questions and answers. The answers are invariably, I believe, meaningless, although of course my wife will tell you different. Balderdash, and he went at the fire again. "Schoolgirls," he said, "superstition." "Planchette has been very kind tonight," Mrs. Montague said. "John, there are definitely foreign elements present in this house." "Quite a splendid sitting, really," Arthur said. He waved a sheaf of paper triumphantly. "We've gotten a good deal of information for you," Mrs. Montague said. "Now, Planchette was quite insistent about a nun. Have you learned anything about a nun, John? In Hill House? Not likely." Planchette felt very strongly about a nun, John. "Perhaps something of the sort, a dark, vague figure even, has been seen in the neighborhood, villagers terrified when staggering home late at night. The figure of a nun is a fairly common..." "John, if you please. I assume you are suggesting that I am mistaken, or perhaps it is your intention to point out that Planchette may be mistaken. I assure you, and you must believe, Planchette, even if my word is not good enough for you, that a nun was most specifically suggested. I am only trying to say, my dear, that the wraith of a nun is far and away the most common form of appearance. There has never been such a thing connected with Hill House, but in almost every..." "John, if you please. I assume I may continue. Or is Planchette to be dismissed without a hearing? Thank you."
I love how she talks about it like it's like a person.
Yeah,
like,
Planchette?
No wonder Luke was like, "Wait, who is that?"
It's very like, "You hurt me at?" Mother pokes me at? Oh, 1,000 years jail for mother. Anyways, Mrs. Montague composed herself. Now then, there's also a name spelled variously as Helen or Helene or Elena. Who might that be? My dear, many people have lived. Helen brought us a warning against a mysterious monk. Now, when a monk and a nun both turn up in one house, expect the place was built on an older site, Arthur said. Influences prevailing, you know. Older influences hanging around, he explained more fully. It sounds very much like broken vows, does it not? Very much. Had a lot of that back then, you know. Temptation, probably. I hardly think, the doctor began. I dare say she was walled up alive, Mrs. Montague said. We're just making so many leaps. The nun, I mean. They always did that, you know. You've no idea the messages I've gotten from nuns walled up alive.
That's a common occurrence.
We're in America. Hill House is in America. So I'd just like to go on the record saying, no.
We do not go around
walling nuns up alive. I love it. Oh my God, what is happening? Yeah, I don't know either. Mrs. Montague has come in like a whirlwind to destroy things.
I hope she has an interaction with Mrs. Dudley.
Oh, yes.
So Mrs. Dudley probably just like...
The nun's walled up alive. There is no case on record of any nun ever being... John, may I point out to you once more that I myself have had messages from nuns walled up alive? Do you think I am telling you a fib, John? Or do you suppose that a nun would deliberately pretend to have been walled up alive when she was not? Is it possible that I am mistaken once more, John? Certainly not, my dear, said Dr. Montague sighed wearily. With one candle and a crust of bread, Arthur told Theodora. Horrible thing to do when you think about it. No nun was ever walled up alive.
Let's get that clear.
The doctor said sullenly. He raised his voice slightly. It is a legend, a story, a libel circulated. All right, John, we won't quarrel over it. You may believe whatever you choose. Just understand, however, that sometimes purely materialistic views must give way before facts. Now, it is a proven fact that among the visitations troubling this house are a nun and a... What else was there? Luke asked hastily. I am so interested in hearing what, Planchette had to say. I also would like to point out, like, this is like the equivalent of my feelings equal facts. Like, oh, I know the facts say otherwise, but my feeling tells me. Anyways, Mrs. Montague waggled a finger roguishly. Nothing about you, young man, although one of the ladies present may hear something of interest. Impossible woman, Eleanor thought. Impossible, vulgar, possessive woman. Now, Helen, Mrs. Montague went on, wants us to search the cellar for an old well. Don't tell me Helen was buried alive, the doctor said. I hardly think so, John. I am sure that she would have mentioned it. As a matter of fact, Helen was most unclear about just what we were to find in the well. I doubt, however, that it will be treasure. One so rarely meets with a real treasure in a case of this kind. More likely evidence of the missing nun. More likely 80 years of rubbish. John, I cannot understand the skepticism in you of all people. After all, you did come to this house to collect evidence of supernatural activity, and now when I bring you a full account of the causes and an indication of where to start looking, you're positively scornful. Yeah, because he wanted to do it scientifically. Not planchette. We have no authority to dig up the cellar. Arthur could, Mrs. Montague began hopefully, but the doctor said with firmness, no. My lease on the house specifically forbids me to tamper with the house itself. There will be no digging of cellars, no tearing out of woodwork, no ripping up of floors. Hill House is still a valuable property, and we are students, not vandals. I should think you'd want to know the truth, John. There's nothing I should like to know more. Dr. Montague stamped across the room to the chessboard and took up a knight and regarded it furiously. He looked as though he were doggedly counting to 100. Dear me, how patient one must be sometimes, Mrs. Montague sighed. But I do want to read you the little passage we received toward the end. Arthur, do you have it? Arthur shuffled through his sheaf of papers. It was just after the message about the flowers you were to send to your aunt, Mrs. Montague said. Planchette has a control named Marigot, she explained, and Marigot takes a genuine personal interest in Arthur, brings him words from relatives, and so on. Not a fatal illness, you understand, Arthur said gravely. Have to send flowers, of course, but Marigot is most reassuring. Now, Mrs. Montague selected several pages and turned them over quickly. They were covered with loose, sprawling, penciled words, and Mrs. Montague frowned, running down the pages with her finger. Here, she said. Arthur, you read the questions and I'll read the answers. That way it will sound more natural. Off we go, Arthur said brightly and leaned over Mrs. Montague's shoulder. Now, let me see. Start right about here with who are you? Right up. Who are you? Nell, Mrs. Montague read in her sharp voice, and Eleanor and Theodora and Luke and the doctor turned, listening. Nell who? Eleanor, Nellie, Nell, Nell. They sometimes do that, Mrs. Montague broke off to explain. They repeat a word over and over again to make sure it comes across all right. Arthur cleared his throat. What do you want? He read. Home. Do you want to go home? And Theodora shrugged comically at Eleanor. Want to be home. What are you doing here? Waiting. Waiting for what? Home. Arthur stopped and nodded profoundly. There it is again, he said, like a word, and use it over and over just for the sound of it. Ordinarily, we never ask why, Mrs. Montague said, because it tends to confuse Planchette. However, this time we were bold and came right out and asked, Arthur. Why? Arthur read. Mother, Mrs. Montague read. So you see, this time we were right to ask because Planchette was perfectly free with the answer. Is Hill House your home? Arthur read levelly. Home, Mrs. Montague responded, and the doctor sighed. Are you suffering? Arthur read. No answer here. Mrs. Montague nodded reassuringly. Sometimes they dislike admitting to pain. It tends to discourage those of us left behind, you know. Just like Arthur's aunt, for instance, will never let on that she is sick, but Marigot always lets us know, and it's even worse when they're passed over. Stoical, Arthur confirmed, and read, Can we help you? No, Mrs. Montague read.
Can we do anything at all for you? No. Lost. 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 Mrs. Montague looked up. You see, she asked, one word, over and over again. They love to repeat themselves. I had one word go on to cover a whole page sometimes. What do you want? Arthur read. Mother, Mrs. Montague read back. Why? Child. Where's your mother? Home. Where's your home? Lost, lost, lost. And after that, Mrs. Montague said, folding the paper briskly, there was nothing but gibberish. Never known planchette so cooperative, Arthur said confidingly to Theodora. Quite an experience, really. But why pick on Nell? Theodora asked with an annoyance. Your fool planchette has no right to send messages to people without permission, or you'll never get results by abusing planchette, Arthur began.
Do not abuse planchette.
Frickin' planchette.
Frickin' planchette, yeah.
But Mrs. Montague interrupted him, swinging to stare at Eleanor. You're Nell? She demanded, and turned on Theodora. We thought you were Nell, she said. So, said Theodora impudently. It doesn't affect the messages, of course, Mrs. Montague said, tapping her paper irritably. Although I do think we might have been correctly introduced.
You were introduced perfectly fine. You didn't stop talking the whole time you were being introduced.
It was like, I won't remember your names.
I'll learn your names eventually. Yeah. And also, how dare you, start dinner without us, even though we're so late that apparently they start. So, this is Montague's lot.
Yes. I'm sure that planchette knew the difference between you, but I certainly do not care to be misled.
I'm sure the object knew.
Don't feel neglected, Luke said to Theodora. We will bear you alive.
Don't worry. You can be the nun we bury alive.
Joy.
Yay.
When I get a message from that thing, Theodora said, I expect it to be about hidden treasure. None of this nonsense about sending flowers to my aunt. They are all carefully avoiding looking at me, Eleanor thought. I have been singled out again, and they are kind enough to pretend it is nothing. Why do you think all that was sent to me? She asked, helpless. Really, child, Mrs. Montague said, dropping the papers on the low table. I couldn't begin to say, although you are rather more than a child, aren't you?
She's 32.
Perhaps you are more receptive psychically than you realize. Although, and she turned away indifferently, how you could be a week in this house and not picking up the simplest message from beyond, that fire wants stirring.
She has gotten messages from beyond.
Nell doesn't want messages from beyond, Theodora said comfortingly, moving to take Eleanor's cold hand in hers. Nell wants her warm bed and a little sleep. Peace, Eleanor thought concretely. What I want in all this world is peace. A quiet spot to lie and think, a quiet spot among the flowers where I can dream and tell myself sweet stories.
At least you stopped thinking about killing Theodora.
Yes, that was...
that was rough.
That was weird.
Yeah. Now we can move to thinking about killing Mrs. Montague.
I think they'll all be in on it.
I mean, yeah, I think at this point,
except
even
Arthur.
Yeah, except Arthur, but he should probably be taken out too.
I, Arthur said richly, shall make my headquarters in the small room just this side of the nursery, well within shouting distance. I shall have with me a drawn revolver. Do not take alarm, ladies. I am an excellent shot.
If you're an excellent shot, you don't have to tell people you're an excellent shot.
And a flashlight, in addition to a most piercing whistle.
Oh, thank God.
I will have no difficulty summoning the rest of you in case I observe anything worth your notice, or I require company.
Company require Arthur, and is Mrs. Montague going to cover that type of company? Because I can guess.
Makes me uncomfortable. I don't like his addition of company.
I'm sure he means to fight the ghost.
Sure. Also, I'm not coming if you whistle at me.
Yeah, if you whistle at me, I'm not coming. We'll be locking my door. I'm going out the window.
You may all sleep quietly, I assure you. Arthur, Mrs. Montague explained, will patrol the house every hour regularly.
By himself.
He will make a round of the upstairs rooms. I think he need hardly bother with the downstairs rooms tonight, since I shall be up here. We have done this before, many times.
More proof they're having an affair?
Many times.
Many times.
Come along.
Many times.
Come along, everyone. Silently, they followed her up the staircase, watching her little affectionate dabs at the stair rail and the carvings on the walls. It is such a blessing, she said once, to know that beings in this house are only waiting for an opportunity to tell their stories and free themselves from the burden of their sorrow. Now, Arthur will first of all inspect the bedrooms. Arthur?
I feel like Mrs. Montague's fatal flaw in this is assuming that it's entities in the house and it's not the house itself.
Yes. She's like, oh, I can befriend and mother these little entities.
Let me mother the ghosts. And it's like, it's not ghosts, it's the house. So I like that we have a comment that says, conflicted on whether or not I want Mrs. Montague to be 100% right of everything. Yeah. And now taking bets on how their bodies will be found. Arthur shot, Mrs. Montague buried in the wall while wearing a habit. I love it.
Yes, yes.
Right. Yes. Anyways, apologies, ladies.
With apologies, ladies, with apologies, Arthur said, opening the door of the blue room, which Eleanor and Theodora shared. A dainty spot, he said plumply, fit for two such charming ladies. I shall, if you like, save you the trouble of glancing into the closet and under the bed.
Thanks for patronizing me, Arthur.
Solemnly, they watched Arthur go down onto his hands and knees and look under the beds and then rise, dusting his hands. Perfectly safe, he said. Now, where am I to be? Mrs. Montague asked. Where did that young man put my bags? Directly at the end of the hall, the doctor said. We call it the nursery. Mrs. Montague, followed by Arthur, moved purposefully down the hall, passing the cold spot in the hall, and shivered. I will certainly need extra blankets, she said. Have that young man bring extra blankets from one of the other rooms. Opening the nursery door, she nodded and said, the bed looks quite fresh, I must admit. But has the room been aired?
What does it matter? You're there to talk to ghosts.
I told Mrs. Dudley, the doctor said. It smells musty. Arthur, you will have to open that window in spite of the cold.
I kind of hope they find their bodies tomorrow morning. I can't remember if they do.
Drearily, the animals on the nursery wall looked down on Mrs. Montague. Are you sure? The doctor hesitated and glanced up apprehensively at the grinning faces over the nursery door. I wonder if you ought to have someone in here with you, he said.
No, this is fine. This is her lesson to learn. This is her trauma lesson to learn.
My dear, Mrs. Montague, good humor now in the presence of those who had passed beyond, was amused. How many hours, how many hours have I sat in purest love and understanding, alone in a room, and yet never alone.
Someone's called her Karen Montague. I love it.
My dear, how could I make you perceive that there is no danger where there is nothing but love and sympathetic understanding?
Yeah, this house, super full of love.
So much love.
So much love. So much understanding. Welcome to Hill House.
That's their tagline.
Yeah.
Home of love and understanding.
Yeah, Hill House. Home of love and understanding.
I am here to help these unfortunate beings. I am here to extend the hand of heartfelt fondness and let them know that there are still some who remember, who will listen and weep for them. Their loneliness is over, and yes, said the doctor, but leave the door open.
Yeah, I get it.
Unlocked, if you insist, Mrs. Montague was positively magnanimous.
Just close the door.
I shall be only down the hall, the doctor said. I can hardly offer to patrol, since that will be Arthur's occupation. But if you need anything, I can hear you.
I can hear you.
I know what you're doing in there.
Doc, no, this is your chance. Be free. Yeah.
Be free.
This is a divorce waiting to happen.
Clearly. Mrs. Montague laughed and waved her hand at him. These others need your protection so much more than I, she said. I will do what I can, of course, but they are so very, very vulnerable with their hard hearts and their unseeing eyes.
You've seen so much stuff.
You poor dears and your unseeing eyes.
Yeah, now that I'm here, the expert.
Arthur, followed by a Luke looking very much amused, returned from checking the other bedrooms on the floor and nodded briskly at the doctor. All clear, he said. Perfectly safe for you to go to bed now. Thank you, the doctor told him soberly, and then said to his wife, Good night, be careful. Good Good night, Mrs. Montague said, and smiled around to all of them. Please don't be afraid, she said. No matter what happens, remember that I am here.
Thank God. Now that you're here, all the ghosts will focus on you, because you're being real stupid.
Good night, Theodora said, and good night, said Luke, and with Arthur behind them, assuring them that they might rest quietly and not to worry if they heard shots. And he would start his first patrol at midnight. Eleanor and Theodora went into their own room, and Luke on down the hall to his.
Yeah, don't worry if you hear shots in the night.
Okay.
Cool. That's how you get away with a murder, you know?
Right.
You could easily kill Dr. Montague and Mrs. Montague and be gone by day. Like, yeah, don't worry if you hear shots. Just me firing at ghosts. Because we all know how much bullets do against a ghost. I don't like Arthur.
After a moment, the doctor turned reluctantly away from his wife's closed door. Followed. Wait, Theodora said to Eleanor once in their room. Luke said that they want us down the hall. Don't get undressed.
Be quiet.
And be quiet. She opened the door crack and whispered over her shoulder. I swear that old biddy's going to blow this house wide open with that perfect love business. If I ever saw a place that had no use for perfect love, it's Hill House.
Yeah, seriously.
Now, Arthur closed his door. Quick, be quiet. Silently, making no sound on the hall carpeting, they hurried in their stocking feet down the hall to the doctor's room. Hurry, the doctor said, opening the door just wide enough for them to come in. Be quiet. It's not safe, Luke said, closing the door to a crack and coming back to sit on the floor. That man's going to shoot somebody.
Yeah, he is. He's an idiot.
I don't like it, the doctor said, worried. Luke and I will stay up and watch, and I want you two ladies in here where we can keep an eye on you. Something's going to happen, he said. I don't like it. I just hope she didn't go and make anything mad with her planchette, Theodora said. Sorry, Dr. Montague. I don't intend to speak rudely of your wife. The doctor laughed, but stayed with his eye to the door. She originally planned to come for our entire stay, he said, but she had enrolled in a course in yoga and could not miss her meetings.
Thank goodness.
She is an excellent woman in most respects, he added, looking earnestly around at them. She is a good wife and takes very good care of me. She does things splendidly, really. Buttons on my shirts. He smiled hopefully.
He's really stretching.
This is a good button, she said.
Well, you know, she repairs my shirts.
This, and he gestured in the direction of the hall, this is practically her only vice. Practically.
Practically.
Perhaps she feels she's helping you with your work, Eleanor said. The doctor grimaced and shivered. At that moment, the door swung open and then crashed shut, and in the silence outside, they could hear slow, rushing movements as though a very steady, very strong wind were blowing the length of the hall. Glancing at one another, they tried to smile, tried to look courageous under the slow coming of the unreal cold, and then, through the noise of the wind and the knocking on the doors downstairs. Without a word, Theodora took up the quilt from the foot of the doctor's bed and folded it around Eleanor and herself, and they moved close together, slowly in order not to make a sound. Eleanor, clinging to Theodora, deadly cold in spite of Theodora's arms around her, thought, It knows my name. It knows my name this time. The pounding came up the stairs, crashing on each step. The doctor was tense, standing by the door, and Luke moved over to stand beside him. It's nowhere near the nursery, he said to the doctor, and put his hand out to stop the doctor from opening the door. How weary one gets of this constant pounding, Theodora said ridiculously. Next summer, I must really go somewhere else. There are disadvantages everywhere, Luke told her. In the lake regions, you get mosquitoes.
So like someone, when we were talking about like the buttons on his shirt. Doc, the bar is in hell. That's how low the bar is.
Oh my god.
Perfect. Anyways, mosquitoes, haunted house.
I don't know. I mean, I do really hate mosquitoes, and so I don't know. It's kind of, you know.
House that drives you insane, mosquitoes. Seems like an even.
Hard choice.
Yeah, hard choice.
Could we have exhausted the repertoire of Hill House? Theodora asked, her voice shaking in spite of her light tone. Seems like we've had this pounding act before. Is it going to start everything all over again? The crashing echoed along the hall, seeming to come from the far end, the furthest from the nursery, and the doctor, tense against the door, shook his head anxiously. I'm going to have to go out there, he said. She might be frightened, he told them. Eleanor, rocking to the pounding, which seemed inside her head as much as in the hall, holding tight to Theodora, said, They know where we are. And the others, assuming that she meant Arthur and Mrs. Montague, nodded and listened.
Oh, I
thought that's what she meant at first, too. And
they know where we are. And all four of them are together.
The knocking, Eleanor told herself, pressing her hands to her eyes and swaying with the noise, will go on down the hall. It will go on to the end of the hall and turn and come back again. It will just go on and on the way it did before, and then we will stop, and we will look at each other and laugh and try to remember how cold we were and the little swimming curls of fear on our backs. After a while, it will stop. It never hurt us, Theodora was telling the doctor across the noise of the pounding. It won't hurt them. I only hope she doesn't try to do anything about it, the doctor said grimly.
It's a real danger.
He was still at the door, but seemingly unable to open it against the volume of noise outside. I feel positively like an old hand at this, Theodora said to Eleanor. Come closer now, keep warm. And she pulled Eleanor even nearer to her under the blanket, and the sickening, still cold surrounded them. Then there came silence. Well, I don't know what I was reading. Then there came, suddenly, quiet, and the secret, creeping silence they all remembered. Holding their breaths, they looked at one another. The doctor held the doorknob with both hands, and Luke, although his face was white and his voice trembled, said lightly, Brandy, anyone? My passion for spirits.
Spirits.
No, Theodora giggled wildly. Not that pun, she said. Sorry, you won't believe me, Luke said, the brandy decanter rattling against the glass as he tried to pour. But I no longer think of it as a pun. That is what living in a haunted house does for a sense of humor.
Yeah.
Using both hands to carry the glass, he came to the bed where Theodora and Eleanor huddled under the blanket, and Theodora brought out one hand and took the glass. Here, she said, holding it to Eleanor's mouth, drink. Sipping, not warmed, Eleanor thought, we are in the eye of the storm. There is not much more time. She watched Luke carefully carry a glass of brandy over to the doctor and hold it out, and then, without comprehending, watched the glass slip through Luke's fingers to the floor as the door was shaken violently and silently. Luke pulled the doctor back, and the door was attacked without sound, seemingly almost to be pulling away from its hinges, almost ready to buckle and go down, leaving them exposed. Backing away, Luke and the doctor waited, tense and helpless. It can't get in, Theodora was whispering over and over, her eyes on the door. It can't get in. Don't let it get in. It can't get in. The shaking stopped. The door was quiet, and the little caressing touch began on the doorknob, feeling intimately and softly, and then, because the door was locked, patting and fondling the doorframe as though wheedling to be let in. It knows we're here, Eleanor whispered, and Luke looked back at her over his shoulder, gestured furiously for her to be quiet. It is so cold, Eleanor thought childishly. I will never be able to sleep again with all this noise coming from inside my head. How can these others hear the noise when it is coming from inside my head? I am disappearing inch by inch into this house. I am going apart a little bit at a time because all this noise is breaking me. Why are the others frightened? She was aware dully that the pounding had begun again. The metallic, overwhelming sound of it washed over her like waves. She put her cold hands to her mouth to feel if her face was still there. I have had enough, she thought. I am too cold. At the nursery door, Luke said tensely, speaking clearly through the noise. At the nursery door, don't. And he put out a hand to stop the doctor. Purest love, Theodore said madly. Purest love. And she began to giggle again.
Some people react to stress by laughing.
Yes. If they don't open the doors, Luke said to the doctor. The doctor stood now with his head against the door, listening, with Luke holding his arm to keep him from moving. Now we are going to have a new noise, Eleanor thought, listening to the inside of her head. It is changing. The pounding had stopped, as though it had proved ineffectual, and there was now a swift movement up and down the hall, as of an animal pacing back and forth with unbelievable impatience, watching first one door and then another, alert for a movement inside. And there was again the little babbling murmur which Eleanor remembered. Am I doing it? She wondered quickly. Is that me? And heard the tiny laughter beyond the door, mocking her. Fee, fi, fo, fum, Theodora said under her breath, and the laughter swelled and became a shouting. It's inside my head, Eleanor thought, putting her hands over her face. It's inside my head, and it's getting out, getting out, getting out. Now the house shivered and shook, the curtains dashing out against the windows, the furniture swaying, and the noise in the hall became so great that it pushed against the walls. They could hear breaking glass as the pictures in the hall came down, and perhaps the smashing of windows. Luke and the doctor strained against the door as though desperately holding it shut, and the floor moved under their feet. We're going, Eleanor thought, and heard Theodora say far away, the house is coming down. She sounded calm and beyond fear, holding to the bed, buffeted and shaken. Eleanor put her head down and closed her eyes and bit her lips against the cold and felt the sickening drop as the room fell away beneath her, and then right itself, and then turned slowly, swinging. God Almighty, Theodora said, and a mile away at the door, Luke caught the doctor and held him upright. Are you all right? Luke called, back bracing against the door, holding the doctor by the shoulders. Theo, are you all right? Hanging on, Theodora said. I don't know about Nell. Keep her warm, Luke said far away. We haven't seen it all yet. His voice trailed away. Eleanor could hear and see him far away in the distant room, where he and Theodora and the doctor still waited. In the churning darkness, where she fell endlessly, nothing was real except her own hands, white around the bedpost. She could see them, very small, and see them tighten when the bed rocked, and the wall leaned forward, and the door turned sideways far away. Somewhere there was a great shaking crash as some huge thing came headlong. It must be the tower, Eleanor thought, and I supposed it would stand for years. We are lost, lost. The house is destroying itself. She heard the laughter over all, coming thin and lunatic, rising in its little crazy tune, and thought, no, it is over for me. It is too much, she thought. I will relinquish my possession of this self of mine, abdicate, give over willingly, that I never wanted at all. Whatever it wants of me, it can have. I'll come, she said out loud, and was speaking up to Theodora, who leaned over her. The room was perfectly quiet, and between the still curtains at the window, she could see the sunlight. Luke sat in a chair by the window. His face was bruised, and his shirt was torn, and he was still drinking brandy. The doctor sat back in another chair, his hair freshly combed, looking neat and dapper and self-possessed. Theodora leaned over Eleanor and said, She's all right, I think. And Eleanor sat up and shook her head, staring. Composed and quiet, the house lifted itself primly around her, and nothing had been moved. How? Eleanor said, and all three of them laughed. Another day, the doctor said, and in spite of his appearance, his voice was wan. Another night, he said. As I tried to say earlier, Luke remarked, living in a haunted house plays hell with a sense of humor. I really did not intend to make a forbidden pun, he told Theodora.
Spirit.
How are they? Eleanor asked, the words sounding unfamiliar and her mouth stiff. Both sleeping like babies, the doctor said. Actually, he said, as though continuing a conversation begun while Eleanor slept, I cannot believe that my wife stirred up that storm, but I do admit that one more word about pure love. What happened? Eleanor asked. I must have been gritting my teeth all night, she thought, the way my mouth feels. Hill House went dancing, Theodora said, taking us along on a mad midnight fling. At least I think it was dancing. It might have been turning somersaults. Who knows? It's almost 9, the doctor said, when Eleanor is ready. Come along, baby, Theodore said. Theo will wash your face for you and make you all neat for breakfast.
Yep. So as far as we can tell, based only on that, Mrs. Montague and Arthur experienced nothing.
Of course not.
They're sleeping like babies.
Together?
Maybe. Maybe. That was chapter 7 of Hill House. Have you decided if you want to be Theodore or Eleanor for next week's episode yet?
Do I want to be like maybe going super mad?
Yeah, you want to do rock, paper, scissors for who has to be the one that Hill House is most into?
Okay, let's do it.
Who are we doing? Winner is Eleanor or loser is Eleanor?
Loser.
Loser's Eleanor.
Yeah.
All right, you ready?
Okay. Rock, paper, scissors, shoot.
All right, I guess I'm Eleanor. So join us next week for the conclusion of The Haunting of Hill House. We'll be reading chapters 8 and 9, so it might go a little long, but we will be dressed as Eleanor and Theodora. Once again, if you want to catch up or rewatch before the finale, you can check out our YouTube page to see, just search Deerfield Public Library on YouTube to see all of our videos, all of our Haunting of Hill House videos. And join us next Monday around 1 p.m. for the conclusion of the Haunting of Hill House. Woo! Spooky.
Stay spooky.
Stay spooky, my friends.